the impact of the energy transition or evolution, we can say, on the economy of New Mexico. So Matthias will be our moderator for this panel session. Thank you very much.
All right, is everybody back? We'll go ahead and get started. So just as moderator, I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a story that kind of tells the tale of at least one window of energy transition. So again, I'm working with the natural gas processing plant, and one of the things we talked about earlier is sour gas. So sour gas is something that comes from when again an operator drills a well looking for oil and gas. They bring that up to the surface. Everything's separated with the oil, the gas, the water, and then some of the other impurities. So if it's a sour field, that CO2 will come up with H2S. We talked about AGI wells and how that's captured and it's injected. Now, the other side of this is sweet gas. So sweet gas is the CO2 that comes up in a sweet field where there is no H2S. So the standard way of handling that gas throughout the industry globally is to strip the sweet CO2 off with amine systems and vent it into the atmosphere. So the EPA, NMED, all the states, it is legal in your permit to vent CO2 at high concentrations because it's not one of the criteria 7 pollutants that EPA is concerned about. So if you're an operator and you are bringing in gas from upstream clients in a sweet field, that will all come into your gas processing gathering system, and you will put a field amine system out. And that field amine system allows you to not have to invest in a larger pipeline, larger compressors, more electricity to send that to a plant that could be 10, 20 miles away and then inject it. So in the operation I was just associated with, we were venting and are venting 500,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every day, or every year, not every day, every year. So, and again, that's in the permit. When we first started talking about this in the sequestration world, I was talking with the cabinet secretary at the time for NMED, and she was telling me that she was just always shocked when she used to permit those locations at how much CO2 is being vented. So from an energy transition standpoint, here we are now 3 years after that first MRV plan for the Red Hills processing plant. I'm getting emails today on my phone. Engineering is very excited, and they're working on an entirely new system to take that sweet CO2, again, 20 miles away from the plant, invest in larger compressors, larger pipelines, and instead of just vent that, send it over to the plant to inject that with the sour gas. One thing I'll say before I'll hand it over is the uphill battle of that has been shocking, because you would talk to industry, NGOs, regulators, and the pushback from my viewpoint on sequestration is just kind of shocking to me. So to me, knowing we're venting 500,000 tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year and wanting to not do that as an industry person, but then have the NGO community or others, just all the communities say, no, I don't want to support sequestration. It's like saying, I want you to just keep dumping junk into the atmosphere. That's my preference, which just breaks your brain because it's better for the environment. So to me, again, before I hand over, the changes we've all seen in the industry is when you separate the water, the oil, and the gas. Historically, industry would separate the water and pour it down the arroyo, and it would eventually get to the Gulf of Mexico and kill everything on its way. And I think we all agree that's bad now. We shouldn't do that. So we said we shouldn't do that. We should capture it. We should inject it. To me, venting this CO2 that's a pure waste that came from the ground and really needs to go back where it came from is the same thing as just dumping something down the arroyo. And it's something we could do something about. So it really gets back to the point that the education and groups like this are very valuable, because if we all know what we're talking about, we all know the benefits that come, then we can really change the economic scenario that we're all dealing with and really make some great impacts for the environment. So with that said, I'm going to hand this one over to Dr. Balch. He's going to give an overview of the economy, the transitions, and how that can affect the economy. And I'll let you take it.
I'm going to stand up so I can see the screen and you don't have to just look at the side of my head. All right. So a few years ago, I started a deep dive on energy transitions and in particular challenges for them, because I know as a scientist and an engineer, people tell us we have to solve these problems. So you have to put some parameters around those problems so you can actually do that. So what is an energy transition? In a broad sense, an energy transition is a shift in technologies and behaviors that are needed to replace one source of energy with another. All right. So has this happened before? I used to think so. I used to think 1750 in England, you had the Industrial Revolution, you shift from biomass to coal. And then from there, you went from coal to oil and gas, then hydro, nuclear, and then finally renewables. But arguably, I think there's only been one energy transition and it's still in progress. Started in 1750 or so. You have the biomass, you went to coal, oil, gas around 1850, hydro, 1891, wind in 1895. Actually, around 1900, there were more than 1,000 electric windmills in Denmark. Nuclear, 1951, solar PV, 1950s as well, and then what we consider modern renewables in 1981 or 1980 or so. So the thing is, all these power sources are still in use. In fact, some coal plants now are being converted to biomass. So you're actually increasing the use of biomass, and that hasn't gone away. So I think that to me, it's important to think that energy transitions are long-term processes, usually resulting from finding something that's better or cheaper, but really finding something that you can add to the energy that you had available to you before. So things don't go away, they just kind of pile up. So that's not the way we think of an energy transition today. This is a more 2000s version of an energy transition. This is a global or local shift in the world energy sector from fossil-based fuels to renewables or carbon neutral power sources. All right. So where is this occurring? There's some countries that have established energy transition goals. New Mexico is a state that has done that. But you're really talking about countries in North America, countries in Europe and Far East Asia, and a few countries in South America primarily. And these are coincidentally what we call OECD countries. That's an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. All right, so some states and countries are aggressively changing policies to pursue these goals, often with phased approaches. But many places in the world are taking a much softer approach. They're doing what they can, but they're also depending now and into the future on energy that we've been using already for hundreds of years. And I think that here, probably the most significant issue is politics, in particular geopolitics, that creates a real challenge. I think it was mentioned earlier in the last panel, we need like a Manhattan Project for getting this done in time. But how do you convince India and China and Africa to do it the same way that we're doing it? So global energy mix in 2050, this is from EIA, but you can see roughly the same data from IEA, which is International Energy Association, and also IEA, GHG, EDF, and others. What you see between 2020 and 2050 is that worldwide coal use stays about the same. Natural gas use goes up a little bit. Petroleum and other liquids goes up a little bit. But you see this great growth in renewables. It's the fastest growing category. 45% of new power in 2050 will be from renewables. Problem is 50% increase in demand in the same time period. So it's replacing new demand, and actually you're increasing the use of all these traditional sources. So that's an energy transition that's not happening the way we want it to. So I think that we have a tendency to look to ourselves and look to our communities, our states. And we're doing a great job here in New Mexico. California's doing an okay job. Germany, a few other places in the world are actually carbon zero, mainly because they only have biomass as energy. But if you look at those OECD countries, coal is going in half. Nuclear is declining, natural gas increasing, but oil staying about the same. And you have a good, healthy growth in renewables right around that 30% per year number that was given earlier. If you look at the rest of the world, you are not having the same picture. You're seeing a growth in nuclear, a slight growth in coal, a growth in natural gas, a growth in petroleum, and a growth in renewables. And while renewables is the fastest growing category, everything is growing because energy demand is growing. And if you want everybody in an electric vehicle, you need twice as much power as we have right now. That's a challenge. And for the Paris Accord, there's some real bad news here. Those OECD countries that are trying to decarbonize are about a third of the world emissions. So you have to do it here, but you also have to convince other people to do it at the same pace that you're doing it. So how do we force an energy transition? Because in the past, we just sort of naturally let it happen. You have to look at this challenge. Hydrocarbon energy is very pervasive. Coal-fired power right now is about 30% of world CO2 emissions. Natural gas, 22%, vehicle fuel, 9%. We have some other things, critical building materials, cement and steel and glass, that have significant emissions associated with them. And then there's challenges around strategic minerals, things like lithium, rare earth elements, et cetera. So a lot of these things are rapidly evolving, but time is actually also starting to run out. When I first started to look at this stuff in my research career 25 years ago, the only positive thing that has happened since then is that solar has gotten really cheap and wind is scaled up, but nothing else has changed. Economics, because we're talking about the economic implications of ETA to New Mexico. We've been an energy exporter since the 1930s, and that may be changing. We can certainly generate a lot of wind and solar here, but we may not be able to dispatch it the way we used to. But we used to have coal power mostly sent to the West, oil and gas sent all over the world. And now we have renewables, and we don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But if you look at some of the economic impacts, we can maintain ourselves as an energy exporter with renewables. You need people for grid buildups, power lines, wind and solar farm. That creates infrastructure jobs. But you need less people for long-term operations. There's a big solar array on the Navajo Nation, I think has 2 people that dust them off. Took hundreds to build it. There's also some downsides for transitions, and we don't always think of these things because a lot of our energy generation is in other places. But if you look at all those coal plants that were shut down on the Navajo Nation or around the Navajo Nation, every one of those had 400 to 600 employees. And the coal mines associated with them had a couple hundred people working there too. And you had trucking and things like that. So you need to think about how you're going to replace that economic component. So there's one power station left up there, Four Corners. It is a 10 million ton a year emitter of CO2. It also is 42% of the Navajo Nation's revenue. So they're considering keeping it. That means it's important to consider the goals rather than the ideals. So the ideal is let's get rid of hydrocarbons. But the goal is really to not emit the CO2. So if you can put capture on that plant and save it, saves the jobs, also creates a big source of dispatchable power that can act like a giant battery until we have one. So that's what I have to say.